there was always like this anti-scientific approach to things, where it was like either you had to choose religion or either you had to pick science, and that was it. Islam never had that. I mean, when you read the Qur'an, it talks about the stars and the moon. It talks about, tides and how the tides work. And it talks about, how Allah created the body and how a baby is born and all of these things. So it really emphasizes that, everything in our religion has to be rational and it has to be spiritual. Because at that time, there was such a restriction on Christians being scientists due to it being against religion and being against the faith. But as I said, cleanliness and, doing ablution 5 times a day in itself is just, such an important thing for us to spiritually cleanse ourselves, but also physically. And that's what I'm explaining, is that like public health, in Islam was always there. I find that a lot of Islam is based on optimism. Optimism is a really big part of our religion. So we don't view things from the lens of, God is going to punish us. God is, this angry being who's just out there to get us. You consistently see in the Qur'an it talking about Allah being merciful.
You have to go and you have to put your head to the ground and remember that we're all here by the grace of God anyways. There's nothing that befalls us in this life that isn't for our own benefit. When you have that kind of, like you were saying, positive perspective or optimism, it really helps to bring back into focus what's important in life.
Yeah, and I think specifically, women are generally more emotional. And I find it very interesting because we have this concept in America of like the walk of shame in the morning, after like a one-night stand. And then there's the whole thing of like, is this man going to call me again? Is he going to see me again? Or did he just use me for the night and that's it?
Assalamu alaikum, dear listeners. Today we will be talking about Islam and science. From its inception, Islam has promoted rational thought as the modus operandi for increasing one's faith. Scientists such as Abdus Salam believe that the Qur'an was the foundation of knowledge for unexplained phenomena in the world around us. And indeed, over time, we have seen that the knowledge within its pages has been confirmed as not only accurate, but astoundingly so for being revealed in the 7th century. Indeed, there are a great many hadith that advocate for the seeking and sharing of knowledge. One such hadith is, "Verily, the angels lower their wings for the seeker of knowledge. The inhabitants of the heavens and earth, even the fish in the depths of the water, seek forgiveness for the scholar. The virtue of the scholar over the worshipper is like the superiority of the moon over the stars. The scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. They do not leave behind gold or silver coins, but rather they leave behind knowledge. Whoever has taken hold of it has been given an abundant share." And that is from Abu Dawud 3641. So it is with these thoughts and ideas like these in mind that we will be discussing the idea of Islam as the promoter and defender of rational thought and science with Nawal Ali, a public health specialist currently residing in the USA. This is Nawal's 5th time being a guest on our show, and I have to say that we are always grateful to be able to tap into her wealth of knowledge. Nawal, welcome back to the show.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are always excited to talk to you. So we could probably start off the show talking about the health aspect in terms of public health and science that Islam has set a foundation for. During your studies, what are some of the profound things that you have found?
Yeah, so because my work is mostly in health, a lot of the knowledge I have of Islam is coming from what I see in the world of health. Um, I would say that one of the most amazing things that I've realized during my years of working in this field is that Islam has laid down the foundation for a healthy lifestyle on a daily basis, and that we don't really contradict science. Like for us, our religion doesn't really contradict science. In reality, it actually, they harmoniously kind of melt together and work together, which is really interesting in comparison to a lot of other religions where it's kind of a either you pick religion or either you pick science kind of deal. So, interestingly enough, Islam really promotes having both a mental and physical healthy lifestyle, which also coincides with having a spiritual presence in our life. So, for example, just basic things. When we eat, we always wash our hands before we eat. We always want to eat an amount of food which does not, make us sick. And we want to eat things which are actually good for our body and not, consume things which are actually really bad for our body. And these are just basic ideas. So, the idea of us not consuming alcohol comes from the understanding that alcohol is really just not good for us. It's not good for our psychological state, our mental and emotional state, and it's not good for the physical either. And there's been a huge study on alcohol and its effects on humans, where they used to say a glass of red wine a day is really good for you, but eventually they had this huge study that they did recently, and they found that there was 0% benefit in people who consumed alcohol, and on the contrary, they found that disease was more prevalent in people who consumed alcohol, even if it was a little bit a day. So, just basic things like that have always been a part of our religion. Then we have other things like, for example, prayer. So for many people, prayer is just, it's just something ritual. But, when we look at, so now there's the whole yoga trend going around. And when we look at a lot of what they call the basic poses of yoga, which they say everyone should be doing and are really healthy for us, we find that a lot of those same movements are actually being utilized in our way of praying. And that 5 minutes, 5 times a day, where you pray is basically the equivalent of meditation, which is what we need as humans to have a better psychological state of mind. So for what seemed like, oh, we're just kind of doing this because we've been asked to do it, actually has a lot of understanding and importance behind it. And these are just like some basic things that Islam promotes.
Mm-hmm. And so it's usually not until years and years later that we do understand and the science catches up with what the Quran has actually been telling us for centuries, right? So I know you had mentioned before fasting, and the newest fad is intermittent fasting, but we actually have engaged in this during Ramadan every year. So what are some of the health benefits that we see from fasting during Ramadan?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to Ramadan, there's a lot of things going on at the same time. So of course Ramadan is not just 30 days where you're not eating, it's actually 30 days where you're kind of resetting your stomach, but also resetting the mind and the rest of the body as well. So number one, you're supposed to be eating less, I should say. And you should be obviously engaging in a healthier eating lifestyle during this time. So you're trying to consume more water. You're trying to eat foods that are, obviously going to last you throughout the day. So like if you're just eating a bag of chips, you're most likely going to be feeling hungry. So the whole idea of, us not eating for 16 to, however many hours, it kind of forces you to rethink your food choices, or at least it should be. But also it's helping with, people who might have issues with weight. It puts you into a state of, it basically curbs your eating. So you're able to kind of clean out your body and basically start the process of getting back to a more normal weight, or at least trying to lose some of that weight. We also see that in Ramadan, you're changing your sleeping habits and you're building better sleeping habits. You're waking up earlier and you're sleeping, at a more reasonable time as well. Of course, we have Ramadans where you're actually staying up more, but the idea is like we are trying to, fix our morning routine by waking up earlier, by having a more productive day, and not focusing our day just on food or on sex or on some of our other addictions. So we find that it's all about self-control, about balance, and it's based on building a better spiritual self.
So it's not just it's not just a physical fast. It's also kind of a mental fast, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And it serves as a reminder and a reset of how optimal you could be as a human being, if you would keep the advice of the Qur'an and the way of the Prophet in your mind.
Yeah, and I mean, fasting is not just limited to Ramadan. We also see that we've been asked to fast twice a week. So that's a big part of you don't have to, but it is recommended, and it's all just to kind of reset the body again, because we need to, like everyone is doing these detoxes now, and all these, now, yeah, intermittent fasting has become a new thing, but it's, we should be, in everything in Islam is about balance. So you should be doing this on a consistent basis, and then we do it once a year because it kind of pushes people to commit to 30 days. And there's a saying that, like, it's like to change a habit, you need to do it for 30 days. And that's kind of what Ramadan is about, changing your habits, changing your lifestyle, mentally putting yourself in a better state of mind, because it's not just about the physical things that we're changing, but also the mental things. So, we want to change the way we think. We want to share our wealth and share what we have, and think in a more collective way where we care for others. And, we want to, for people who smoke cigarettes or might have other addictive habits such as pornography, it's a time for you to cut back on those and really get those demons out of your system.
Right. So that's the obligatory fasting. And then you mentioned that it is encouraged to fast on certain days. So those would be for our newly converted, or someone maybe who hasn't converted yet or is thinking about it. This would be Monday and Thursday, because this is the way of the Prophet, or a sunnah, right?
Yeah. So that's like kind of you keeping up with those 30, basically implementing those 30 days into your yearly your yearly routine, basically.
Right.
And that's a whole idea of Ramadan, is like whatever you take from it is being implemented throughout the year. So it's kind of like a 30-day mandatory, training period for you to implement it throughout the rest of your 11 months.
Mhm. And so, as far as medicine goes, what kind of foundation do we find in the Quran and in the history that has promoted Islam's relationship with, um, the fasting is kind of like the prevention side, I would say. So now, what about the side of it where we come up with solutions for the problems that we come across in health?
Yeah, so I think Islam has always had a both prevention and, kind of like when it comes up, how do we solve it type of approach. Um, Obviously, our prevention has always been like, as I said, like washing your hands before you eat, having a consistent, time of the day where you're taking care of yourself through prayer and having like relaxation. I'm sure you already know, for everyone who's listening out there, that we do wudu or ablution like 5 times a day, which is, cleanliness is a really important part of our religion. And it's emphasized that we should stay clean, we should smell nice, we should brush our teeth and shower. All of these things are really important in Islam. It even talks about how you should store food and how you should deal with food that has been tainted, which is something very unique because in a lot of other religions, it doesn't talk about those little mundane things like, what do you do if you have, food that's gone spoiled, or, um, or water that's gone bad. So it's really interesting that, in hadith, you will find hadith which are talking about this and are talking about these concepts. Um, when it comes to finding solutions in medicine, there was always this kind of fear, at least in Christianity, there was a lot of fear towards medicine because it was viewed as something that would contradict religion, and it wouldn't work with religion. And that's why the Christians have always had a lot of, there was always like this anti scientific approach to things, where it was like either you had to choose religion or either you had to pick science, and that was it. Which is why we see historically that a lot of Western scientists have always been either atheist or just, completely non-religious. Islam never had that. I mean, when you read the Qur'an, it talks about the stars and the moon. It talks about, tides and how the tides work, and it talks about, how Allah created the body and how a baby is born, and all of these things. So it really emphasizes that, everything in our religion has to be rational and it has to be spiritual. So, there's a reason for everything that we do. It's not just like Allah wants you to do this or do that without reason. There has to also be a rational reason behind it. Of course, some of that knowledge is considered unknown knowledge, that we don't know for now. But, as times have um, moved forward and more research has been done, a lot of the reasonings for why do we eat with our right hand and not with our left has been proven through, scientific research.
So yeah, that's the major difference I think we have here is that in Islam we are actually charged with finding solutions to some of the problems that we come across on this earth. And in fact, they are found within the very text that we read every year, or we should read every year during Ramadan. And it is your duty as a Muslim to actually become knowledgeable. Whereas, as you were explaining in Christianity, it was one thing or the other, at a certain point, you would have to just put your faith in God. But your faith in God in Islam actually is built upon your rational mind. So, for instance, we're told in the Quran that the moon is refracted light. The light from the moon is actually coming from the sun, and now we know this because of modern science. But back in the 7th century, this was news, right? And so, for this to be a truth that we can pick out of the Quran, and then verify today that it is actually how it works, that kind of makes it easier for you to take the other things on faith that we don't have the proof for yet. For instance, the idea of these jinns in the Quran, or extraterrestrial life, or anything like that. There is the possibility of that. We just don't have the evidence for it yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, when we're talking about solutions, what I wanted to mention was that Islam has always promoted, as you said, seeking out knowledge. So some of the best scientists in the world, in the earlier, times were Muslim, because at that time there was such a restriction on Christians being scientists due to its basically it being against religion and being against the faith. And so Islam, you saw that there was a lot of scientists who were, discovering things in medicine, doing surgeries, doing, autopsies, and were really trying to figure out the anatomy of humans. You saw that there were a lot of people who were Muslim, who were basically investing their time into understanding astronomy and trying to actually dissect these ayahs in the Qur'an, talking about, the stars and the moon, and who came up with a lot of discoveries about constellations and about generally space and what it really holds. So it's really interesting for anyone who's really interested. I would really advise to read some books on this, because it's amazing how much the Qur'an really inspired people to push boundaries and understand the world better through, the eyes of from a basically very Islamic perspective. But those concepts that they discovered, were basically the foundation to what we have now. I mean, algebra is actually something that a Muslim came up with. And as I mentioned, like a lot of the surgical and medical procedures that, that were also the foundation of a lot of the procedures we do now actually came from Muslims. There's actually from what I remember, there's even a museum, which is like this, it's the Museum of medicinal history, or like medicinal and surgical history. I'm trying to remember where that is, but there's like a whole museum devoted to this, because it was really for the time, it was really extraordinary to see people of a certain religion, pushing in these fields, while a lot of other religions just didn't have the openness to, invest time into understanding these concepts.
Right. And so that's a huge shift in the monotheistic traditions. At least in Christianity, I can't speak so much to the Jewish tradition because I'm not quite sure, but it puts your faith in equilibrium with your rational mind. Do we have a good example, a good historical example in medicine of how Islam has helped promote, or a Muslim has helped promote public health?
Yeah, so I actually read, so when I went to Syria, I actually saw that they had these old sewage canals that were really, it was really interesting to see, because it was basically the basically historic version of, the sewer systems we have now. And basically there were these canals that would get all the sewage out of the houses. And I read in this book a long time ago, I don't remember where the writer was from, but I think he was either French or English, and he wrote this book talking about his journey to I think it was to Andalusia, and he spoke about how he had never witnessed such a beautiful place, that there was like flowers everywhere, and that the houses were so clean. And the main thing that he was really curious about was about, how they got rid of feces and urine. And they said, well, we have a sewer system. And he talked about how amazing it was to like witness that there was this canal system taking all of the feces and urine like out of the house basically, and like away from the village. And they he was just so astonished by it. And when people asked him, like, why is this so amazing to you, like what do you do in Northern Europe when you have to use a bathroom or something, like where do you dispose of all of this? He said that they would just throw it out the window onto the public streets. And later it was discovered that this was one of the main reasons why Europe had so much disease, was because there was no proper disposal of feces or urine, and people were just consistently being exposed to it. Not to mention the fact that
Right.
hygiene was very low.
Right.
Unfortunately, a part of that was due to the lack of water, because a lot of, Northern Europe didn't have as many springs and, clean water to use for bathing.
Hmm.
But it was also like a religious thing too, or not a religious thing, but like it was a cultural thing to like not, bathe and not, clean yourself.
Yeah, I think even a superstition that if you bathe too much or if you caught a chill or something, bathing was a problem. So I think that played into it as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you look back at just French kings and British kings, you'll read stories like, this king has only bathed 3 times in his life,
Gross.
and yeah, I mean, but it's true. Like you can read about, all this like royal history, and you'll see like, certain kings were famous for like not bathing their whole life. That they
Hmm.
would just, I mean, I think even in the Greek tradition, they used to just rub olive oil on themselves when they smelled bad. There's no concept of like really like bathing.
And so,
Whereas,
how does Islam revolutionize that thought process?
yeah, I mean, it became a big part of, I mean, for him as a Northern European resident, like he was just completely stunned by the fact that like, we were like growing flowers, that like, we had these, even the ritual of the hammam, of like, bathing, like public bathing houses were something that were popularized by the Muslims, and they
Hmm.
were originally, meant that way because first off, people didn't have, running water in the house. So they would just come to the to the bathhouse and bathe once a week, or twice a week, or whatever it was. And then
Hmm.
they also had, I found this really interesting, but I went to this one town in Turkey, I think it was, because they have a lot of hot springs, and they actually
Hmm.
used to have medicinal bathing houses. So you would actually go there and like lay in water with a bunch of herbs to like cure diseases,
Hmm.
which I found really interesting. But as I said, cleanliness and doing ablution 5 times a day in itself is just, such an important thing for us to spiritually cleanse ourselves, but also physically. And that's what I'm explaining, is that like public health, in Islam it was always there, about caring for ourselves, and for our community as well, because it wasn't just about, okay, I'm keeping myself clean. It was also about keeping others safe from disease as well. So we see
And
that even, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and how relevant is that today in our current pandemic? It just blows your mind really to think about all of the advice that we as Muslims have been following, and then how that still applies to this very day during the pandemic. Because, like, what's the huge thing that they're telling us to do now? We have to sanitize our hands like all the time, wash,
Mhm.
cover our mouths. You could tie this to the niqab if you really wanted to, which again is controversial, but and social distancing I find so interesting because we do in Islam we have constructs for social etiquette, and so one of the things is a lot of men and women don't believe in shaking hands, and this is like a huge thing now where we have to rethink this greeting because we're not supposed to be in contact. So just down to the basics, it really blows my mind how Islam kind of always has a reason. There's a duality for your spiritual as well as your physical, and whatever is being told is the best for you because we believe that the Quran is the actual word of God, and who would know better on how to live an ideal life than the creator of that life,
Yeah. And I've actually read hadith talking about famine in the past. And it talked about if there was famine or if there was, some specific illness, that people should not be leaving the country or the city. So it's kind of interesting that we even have that idea of quarantine in our faith. And it was Ibn Sina who later, talked about quarantine and explained that it was due to the fact that there was these tiny little particles that we couldn't see that basically will spread disease to other places. That's why we have to kind of keep it all, contained. So, as I mentioned, we always had this history of, everything has to be rational and spiritual, and about, collectively keeping our communities healthy and, implementing those ideas into children about washing hands and doing things in a certain way, since, from birth, basically.
Mm-hmm. And so we're talking a lot about the physical. How about we talk some about the mental? So what are some of the pieces of advice that we can find in Islam about balancing our mental health?
Yeah, so with Islam, I find it, I find that a lot of Islam is based on optimism. Optimism is a really big part of our religion. So we don't view things from the lens of, God is going to punish us. God is, this angry, being who's just out there to get us. You consistently see in the Qur'an, it talking about Allah being merciful and being, very loving and caring. And we view a lot of, the things that we call sins, not from the perspective of, if we don't do it, that God is going to hate us for it, but rather as this is something that's actually good for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something that unfortunately, I have seen, when I have seen Muslim people view things like, oh, this is a grave sin, they come from this very cultural mindset of viewing everything as if I don't do it, it's a punishment, when in reality, when you look at the Quran and hadith, it doesn't talk about those things in that way. It actually talks about it from, if you don't do it at the end, it actually really just harms you.
Mm-hmm.
So, prayer, you cannot pray if you don't want to. Allah has given you that choice. He doesn't force you. And actually it tells us that everything in our religion is not by force. Everything in our religion is our own choice, whether or not we want to do it. But at the end of the day, if you don't pray, is it really going to harm Allah? Not really. He doesn't really, he's not really going to be affected by you not praying 5 times a day. But will it harm your mental health by not taking those 5 minutes, 5 times a day to actually bring yourself back into a peaceful, state of mind and getting away from the chaos? Well, probably, because you're, and it kind of helps you to, that prayer actually also helps you to bring things back into perspective. of
Right.
like whatever's going around you, and to actually remember what's really important.
Which
So,
which is kind of like something to hold on to, because I feel like we have a recent surge, especially in suicides, for instance, and
mhm,
that is, in my opinion, a matter of perspective, because something can seem so significant, so huge that you don't know how you're going to bear it or overcome it. But when you go to prayer, you are reminded of how actually small everything is, in the end. And so it brings back that God-centric perspective that sometimes we all need to remember, okay, well, I failed this huge test that is a big part of my career, and what am I going to do now, kind of thing, or something else that you feel just kind of ended your world proverbially, but when you have to go and you have to put your head to the ground and remember that we're all here by the grace of God anyways, and there's nothing that befalls us in this life that isn't for our own benefit. When you have that kind of, like you were saying, positive perspective or optimism, it really helps to bring back into focus what's important in life. And so that test that seemed like a mountain before, or that failure that seemed like something so huge, comes back into perspective and becomes something that you can deal with.
yeah. And I mean, we also believe that nothing is actually ours in this world. That
Right.
if Allah has given us wealth, it's only because He's given it to us,
Right.
but we have to utilize it in the best way possible. Even with children, I mean, a lot of people think, children are theirs to own and that they can do whatever they want with them because it's their property. But we view in Islam that like children come from Allah, and if
Hmm.
He didn't want to grant you those children, you wouldn't get them. So you have to treat them well. You have to raise them to be, good people. Um, we always talk about kindness. So, like a lot of the relationships that Allah discusses or in hadith, which are discussed, are all based in kindness. So, like men treating women well, you know, parents raising children with a lot of, love and care, and also with children showing respect to the elderly. And it's a cycle of like, you have to all be good to each other. Um, we also see that a lot of the mental aspects of Islam, which are, mentioned outside of like prayer and outside of, certain practices, are also linked in, societal things such as having healthy marriages and healthy relationships, and not, viewing, what I really find interesting is like, there's a big emphasis on not viewing women as just objects.
Right. Which is a huge shift in the discussion on women in the course of its history, of course. I mean, um, and yeah, the idea that a woman is kind of like the cornerstone of society, or if the woman is not taken care of, then the society cannot be well, mentality. We find this within the pages of the Quran as well.
Yeah. And, that we should be implementing, so for a lot of people who are like, oh, why should we, why does it matter if we have premarital sex, or why does it matter if I do this or that or whatever? Like all of those things do affect a society in the end. I mean, I recently was reading about this movement. I can't remember what it was called, but they were talking about this movement of, young Christian um, men and women in America. Especially, I'm sure you know that in the South, a lot of people get married quite early, and a lot
Hmm.
of, they were talking about the basically those relationships of like people who get married earlier, and this myth that when you get married earlier, you don't know yourself and you're like more bound to fail, you know,
Mm-hmm.
in a relationship because you're still figuring yourself out. But they actually found that a lot of men who married, you know, their high school sweethearts or, you know, the first love of their life or whatever, you know, they were talking about specifically in Christian communities, actually had the best marriages and the happiest marriages, and they didn't feel this, you know, regret or, you know, longing for like relationships with other women as much as men who had multiple relationships. And the
Mm.
reason for that was because as you grow older, number one, you do become more picky generally.
Right.
um, and you start viewing everything so individualistically, where it's all about, you know, what do I want rather than how can I grow together and bring this together with someone else, you know?
Right.
There's also this acceptance of, you know, when you're younger, like I'm going to have changes. You know, when you're 20, no matter how much it may seem like you know who you are, but you know also that there's going to be a lot of changes in life. Whereas when you're 40, you kind of just feel like you've been through the big changes, so you want something much more specific. But also, they
Mm-hmm.
were talking about in chemically that people who have more relationships, they kind of have this, you know, feeling of um, well, in this relationship I had this, and in this relationship I had that, and it starts to become this comparison of like, you know, where you can't find that perfect fit.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you have one person that you're with, you feel like you're more open to like working through those difficulties and creating, you know, a better version of yourself and that, and creating like a relationship where that person has also the things that you're looking for.
And I think Islam puts a foundation for that as well, because we're told that our spouses are supposed to be the coolness of our eyes and that we're supposed to help each other grow. That's the expectation in Islam of what a healthy relationship between a man and a woman is. And
Hmm.
so I think what you're talking about is it's something called like the honeymoon phase, or it's almost like an addict. These people cannot actually emotionally attach to other people because what they're really seeking is they're actually in love with themselves. I've read a psychological study about this. So they just want to be able to tell their story, the same story over to different people, and they're not actually emotionally connecting with the other person. I think this is a phenomena that comes out of uh, a paradigm where we're not actually caring about the other person. Um, so Islam completely um, obliterates that idea. It's not even something that you would think was rational at all when you look at the advice that the hadith in the Quran has for the relationships between men and women. And while in the modern world, and I use quotes when I say that, we may view the norms with which, you know, Islamic society or Muslims move within their relationships as, you know, outdated, we really have to step back and ask ourselves how much we've grown, where our new ideas about relationships have taken us. Because if we look at the studies, I don't think we'll see that we're being more successful.
Yeah. I mean, they, you know, definitely like we're seeing that there is less and less marriages. And, you know, we're seeing a lot more suicides, especially in middle-aged men in America. Because and a lot of them being not married or being men who don't have very successful relationships. We're also seeing a lot of, I mean, I don't even know what we're in for in the future because it's already been found that children who don't have father figures in their life, they struggle tremendously throughout life. And now we have a whole generation of women having children without, you know, without men from sperm banks and, you know, or, you know, surrogacy. And it's just, it takes a toll on a child not having a father figure or not having a mother figure, you know.
Mm.
And that's what Islam really emphasizes. Even with adoption, it emphasizes not lying to the children
Mm-hmm.
and letting them know that, they do have different parents, because it does take a toll on you not knowing your heritage, not knowing your lineage, and there is something chemical about the bond as well between a mother and a father. A mother and a child, and a father and a child,
Right.
and when
I
you
think that
lie.
that speaks to the beauty of all of the science that we find in Islam. Even in our smallest personal relationships, the ripple effect of that is on the broader community. And so that's why there are all of these specifics for human beings, because as we believe this was the last revelation, so Allah made it the most complete and gave us all of this advice.
hmm Yeah, and I think specifically, women are generally more emotional. And I find it very interesting because we have this concept in America of like the walk of shame in the morning, after like a one night stand. And then there's the whole thing of like, is this man going to call me again? Is he going to see me again? Or did he just use me for the night and that's it? And to
Mhm.
avoid all of that, to avoid the like, the shameful feeling that you feel in the morning, or like, to avoid the emotional heartbreak that you might feel after having an intimate relationship. We just have that safety net of, commitment, where whoever you're with is really committed to you and is not going to walk out on you.
Mhm.
And I think for women, that is really important, because I've of course, I'm American. I've had, non-Muslim friends, and, I've seen, no matter how much people talk about this being a liberating thing, I've seen women suffer the next day, or like talk about how they're like pining for, a guy who they've been with for 6 years to like propose to them.
Right. So I wonder how then Islam is different in regard to how it views science as Christianity in terms of this, because you'll find in the Bible there aren't these specifics, or we don't have one prophet, peace be upon them, who is telling us a way of life. We don't have a collection of hadith. We we're kind of left to our own devices and to allegorical examples in Christianity. And so, for people listening who might be coming from Christianity or who have come from Christianity, it's really important to distinguish between Islam and Christianity in terms of these things. So, if we look back in our Islamic history, is there an example where we have a really good contrast?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about, there's stories about, specifically when Europe was facing a lot of diseases like the bubonic plague and all these other illnesses that were just going around, unfortunately, due to uncleanliness, where people were traveling to the Middle East to get treatment, where they were traveling, especially Christians, because the approach was in Europe that, you got to pray it away. Whereas in the Middle East, it was more about actively trying to resolve this by building better habits, by getting treatments through medicine, and by trying to understand the disease. As I mentioned, we had periods, Ibn Sina specifically, like he really pushed the idea of quarantine being a way to contain a disease and keeping it from spreading and getting worse. Um, I mean, it's just, it's always been a part of our religion to really understand disease not from a point of view of like it being a punishment on our community, but rather, something that can be resolved and not just being covered up symptomatic, like, not covering up just the symptoms. So I think, when we look back at Europe and its history, as I mentioned to you, when you were getting, when you smelled bad, you would just, the French, they're so, well known for perfumes and, all the scents and stuff and all the, flowers and whatnot that they had. But it was all about covering what was underneath. So, if you read the history on wigs in Europe, you'll actually find that they were actually wearing wigs to like cover lice or cover other like scalp conditions that they had because they weren't bathing and they weren't cleaning themselves properly. The whole idea of putting white powder on your face was also to cover a lot of the skin issues they were having.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That puts a whole new perspective on those romantic peace films that you watch.
Yeah. And even the perfumes, it was just to cover the bad smell that you had rather than, just wearing perfume to smell nice. And then so Islam had had a completely different approach, which was to prevent and to treat. So you prevent disease by, keeping clean and, doing things in a certain way, not drinking, Islam even talks about not drinking standing water, like how you should not be drinking from a pool of standing water, how, you should not be, you should be looking at, I remember like reading something about how, you should be even looking at if animals are eating a certain type of food to know if it's like okay to eat. And how we're forbidden from actually eating certain animals. And also the whole idea of like organic food that everyone's talking about now, that was already, present in Islam. We don't eat any animals that have been tortured or abused or have been mistreated.
Right. So it's always been a part of the history. So I think that's a big thing for people to take away from this show is that science in Islam should always help your faith, and Islam should always help you understand science. And if you're finding there's some kind of conflict there, it's probably a misunderstanding on your part. And if you seek more knowledge, it should come to light the wisdom that was already there for you. So we've talked heavily about public and mental health in terms of the scientific beauty of Islam. Is there anything else, any other category you'd like to touch on before we wrap up the show?
Well, as I mentioned, we also always had prophetic medicine, and that's something I can't speak too much about it because I haven't studied it in depth, but I know we've always had this idea of, implementing certain foods into our diet, like honey, like, dates have been something that's been talked about a lot in prophetic medicine and other types of herbs and, foods. I know that we have like the whole idea of like limitation of meat, like not eating too much meat in a day. And I think that it's always, besides prophetic medicine, but like even in mathematics, as I explained, we've always been very heavily invested in mathematics and other types of like medical sciences. The whole idea of growing plants and treating plants well and, having pure and clean agriculture and farming. It's something that we have built a deep, knowledge of, throughout the years. So I would say, I can't really say there's a specific category that should be discussed, but I think generally, for anyone who's interested, they should just, look up a book about, sciences in Islam, because we've done, in the past, we've done extensive research on, all sorts of sciences, and we've had scholars from every, from every, part of the Muslim world who have, really advanced in, sciences of space and sciences of just like water and, whatever else you can think of. We had some of the best scientists who talked about, molecules and what atoms are. All of that was inspired from the Qur'an.
Right. So it kind of has fueled the human curiosity that's naturally within us. It doesn't in any way limit it, or it couldn't be interpreted as they did in early Christianity as being oppositional. It's definitely something that one helps the other. And I just wanted to mention, I think there's actually a hadith that says there isn't a disease that afflicts man that doesn't have a cure within nature, right? So I think a lot of the time that goes hand in hand when we mention honey being a natural remedy. And I know specifically that one in the Qur'an, it actually talks about the female bee being the one that produces the honey, and then in the Quran it was the female version of the verbs being used. So even back, in the 7th century, it's these little pieces of miraculous information that seem astounding, for especially knowing the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was illiterate and not a very learned man. To be able to put that in a book and say it's from anything other than God seems amazing. So if you're interested in science, we do implore you to look at all of the resources. There are a great many for whatever medium you're most comfortable viewing them. Nawal, it's always great to have you on the show, and we do appreciate you sharing your knowledge.
No problem.
Yeah, so we hope, inshallah, this has benefited somebody out there. And if you have other questions or other topics that you would like discussed, you could always submit those on the website. For now, we will sign off. Thank you, dear listener, and assalamu alaikum.